Okay, basically now I'm going to talk about Newman and Butler. Newman was born in 1801 and died in 1890, and Butler was born in 1602 and died in 1752. I'll talk about Newman first because even though he was later, he's got a interesting version of conscience. It's from the Christian perspective, and in modern times it can be seen as quite outdated, but I still think it's important to kind of understand exactly what he was saying and actually see the origin of it in the biblical text. So, Newman, he writes that the conscience is the law of the mind, and that actually, he says, I shall drink to the Pope, if you please, still to conscience first, and to the Pope afterwards. And so what he's basically saying there is, yeah, the Pope's great, the Pope's infallible, that's brilliant, but actually my conscience and the individual conscience is very much the main player in my moral judgment. This is still upheld actually by the Catholic Church today, and being kind of sceptical, it's how a lot of the time they justify using contraception. So obviously the Pope said, nah, let's not. But if an individual Catholic, their conscience tells them that they should, it's actually okay to overrun what the Pope said. Back to Newman though. Catholics another time. Newman, I always think of him as like a telephone, because he's saying that the conscience is the actual voice of God. When you hear your conscience speak to you in a very non-schizophrenic way, that is actually the voice of God. And rather than inventing the truth, like you could say Fromm's does, it actually is a discoverer of the truth. It reveals God's divine law to individuals. It's important to note that both Newman, Augustine, and actually every single Christian, they would argue that the conscience is innate in every single person, regardless of their faith. And actually, what you should do is listen to your conscience and see God as your witness, is what Augustine writes. So when you are spoken to by conscience, you are being spoken to by God to do a certain thing. And for this reason, it's kind of obvious to see what they're going to conclude, and that is that conscience is supreme authority. It is never ever wrong, and you have a moral obligation to obey it. And if you don't, you're in trouble. So this is kind of problematic in a way, because how does Newman then account for varying consciences? So, for example, certain tribes or just certain cultures have very different religious and moral outlooks than, say, the Western culture. So, for example, in England, I would get arrested if I walked around with no clothes on, unless I was on a news speech. But, you know, generally, I just couldn't walk through the town naked. However, in certain cultures, nudity is not an issue. Nudity is a pure and wonderful state, and, you know, we should all whack it out. So this is a kind of minor, you know, it's not really a moral issue, but this is one problem that Newman does encounter in saying that the conscience is the voice of God. Now, in a way, he can kind of overcome it, because he would say that, well, you know, if you have been brought up in a culture, your conscience might be blinded to certain things, to the wickedness of your ways. But he doesn't get to the crux of the argument that actually you could take. He's basically saying that Christianity is the best, and if you aren't Christian, you don't listen to a Christian conscience, you're doing something wrong. I think a lot of people would now argue against that and say that actually we might not necessarily agree about moral choices, but actually they can be of equal value. And like, you can take like Swinburne, Russell, all the big kind of philosophical names. They have very different standpoints on morality. Like, okay, take Hume and Keith Ward. Okay, they are supremely Keith Ward is still alive, but Hume, they were supremely well educated, you know, top of their time, but they have completely contrasting views. And actually, you can't say that someone's conscience can be blinded through ignorance or through wickedness just because they don't agree with you, especially if they have a level of education or knowledge where actually they might even be better educated than you to make certain choices. So that's Newman, and he writes, this is almost his whole argument for conscience. He writes, if, as is the case, we feel responsibility, are ashamed, are frightened at transgressing the voice of conscience, this implies there is one to whom we are responsible, we feel ashamed, and whose claim upon us we fear. That's great, but it's almost now been outed, that view, by modern psychological thought. It's like, you can just go to Freud and Freud and Fromm and see the idea that society plays within making us hear certain voices that actually might not be the voice of God at all. Newman has taken a massive leap from saying, okay, I feel a sense of moral awareness, therefore it's God. And actually, he's missed out the whole point that it might be our social influences, it might be our parents, our family, our friends, any other authority figures. He's missed all of that out. So I think he's almost undermined the value of the human psyche, the human reason. Never mind Newman. Right, on to Butler. Butler wrote that there is a principle of reflection in man by which we distinguish between approval and disapproval of our own actions, and this is conscience. Butler discusses conscience as a supreme authority because it is God-given, it's divinely bestowed on humans. But it's not like Newman's God-driven. It isn't God talking to you, it is literally God's put this conscience into you, and it is your choice and your obligation to seek out, to listen to it, and to do exactly what it says. It's a faculty of reflection, and we use it to judge what we're doing. Butler writes that it majestically asserts itself, so he's suggesting that it is innate in all people, and again, like Newman, that it isn't specific to people of a certain faith or religious belief, but that it's in everyone, and we have that duty to listen to it. Butler overcomes the idea of relativism a little better by saying that wicked people blind their conscience and they don't listen to it. Again, it's open to the exact same flaws as Newman's, in the sense that, is it wicked if someone thinks something different to you? There's a kind of hubris to this Christian approach, which is that Christianity is the supreme religion and that God is the supreme power, and actually anyone who thinks any different is bananas. So Butler gives us kind of like a timeline of what we are as individuals. Firstly, we have our basic needs, our basic drives, a bit like the id from Freud, and that this is just our animalistic survival, basically. And then he says that we have the ability to love others and to love ourselves. And actually it's this wanting to be enlightened and to love and care for others as we love and care for ourselves that drives forward to the principle of reflection, which is the next level. And this is the ability to disapprove and approve of our and others' actions, because we can reflect and think about stuff, a bit like reason. And then you get to conscience, which is the supreme authority. Now, Butler is suggesting that conscience is actually what balances out the benevolence and self-love with the principle of reflection, and it does this kind of job of equalising and maintaining all of the levels of human desire. So our desire for food and our basic needs, our desire for self and others' love, and the principle of reflection, of disapproving and approving of our own actions. Butler doesn't actually investigate whether it's based on reason or if it's created or if it develops. All he says is that conscience is God-given and we must obey it in order to be happy, because just like Newman, it highlights the divine law. Now, if you are overly self-loving, or maybe too reflective, your conscience can be wrong. And this is where his kind of idea of levels is quite useful. Because let's say you love yourself so much, you're a narcissist. Then what your conscience may tell you to do, for example, not give any money to charity and just go and spend it on a photo shoot. I don't know, is that? Anyway, so yeah, let's say you did that and your conscience told you that was the right thing to do. Yeah, you shouldn't give any money to charity. Ugh, charity. If you do that, your conscience has reached a wrong conclusion because it is based on wrong premises. Much like a bad argument, and it's these levels which allow Butler to say that although the conscience is the supreme authority and we should always obey it, if it's based on wrong information, then it will of course be mistaken. It's a bit like putting the wrong ingredients into dinner. Like, you can't expect to make a creme brulee if you don't have any eggs. I don't actually know if you can, there's probably some substitute, but that's just the general idea. The weaknesses, of course, are cultural variation, and also potentially that we could justify any action. If Butler's saying we should always obey our conscience, then actually what if, we can see it with modern terrorist groups. Like, I cannot condone the actions that they take, but they have, and actually using Butler's theory, they have the ability to condone their own actions, to say actually, well, this is what I thought was right, and to cause complete havoc. Another criticism is that because it's from God, Butler doesn't explain how we have maybe a weak or divided conscience. Surely, my big issue is, surely if something is bestowed by God, the supreme greatest authority ever, how can we not listen to it? Like, if you think about the power of God, how would God's voice in Newman's case, or simply a faculty bestowed by God in Butler's case, how would that be able to do anything other than scream the right thing at us? Like, surely God is so powerful that he couldn't be quiet, if you know what I mean? And surely also a benevolent God would want individuals to see what's right and not allow terrorists or other, let's say serial killers, anything, and doing anything else that's wrong. Surely he wouldn't want those people to be able to justify themselves in terms of conscience. Like, if he's benevolent and all powerful. But that's a problem for Boethius, so I'll leave it there. The strengths of Butler. He's got a couple of strengths. It's supported by More's intuitionism, whereby where More's saying we can just recognise the good. We can't describe it, it's a simple notion. We can't describe it, it is just there, and we have the ability to recognise it. But again, that's open to the same criticisms. So that's Butler and Newman.